Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to our workshop this morning. We'll start now, so could I invite you to take your seat? I want to welcome you all here to the workshop. I want to welcome people who are watching us online because we're also streaming. And I want to particularly mention to people who might be watching us somewhere else that you can and should feel free to ask questions. You have the possibility to do that. So we will have room for discussion throughout. Today's event is an overview of the Regional Social Progress Index. I'm sure most of you are somehow involved in the sphere of cohesion or regional policy, and it's possible indeed that some of you may have attended a workshop on this subject. It was launched in October during the open days at the Committee of the Regions. So I certainly don't intend to present the SPI. We have Michael here precisely to do that. I want to welcome you, Michael. Thank you for coming along. How we'll organize today is I'll give you the floor first if you want to tell us what the SPI is, how you've been working on it, some of the findings which you have released in October. And on my left-hand side, I have Moray Gilland, who's head of unit in the Economic Analysis Unit in DG Regio, who will give us his reaction. I would like then, of course, that we have a discussion, and I'm sure that for many of you, you'll be looking ahead to 2017, which will be, of course, a busy year in terms of the post-2020 debate, in terms of the next cohesion report, which we're awaiting. So there are many, many interesting angles and nuggets in the SPI, which we might choose to zoom in on. But let's leave that for the discussion. First, Michael, I will give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good morning. Good morning, everyone. We're still in the morning, just about there. And let me begin by wishing you all a happy Giving Tuesday. Now, who knows it's Giving Tuesday today? No. Well, as you may know, the terrible American habit of Black Friday, the Friday after Thanksgiving, has spread around the world with sales and this awful orgy of consumerism. Well, a few years, a group of people came together and said, well, look, let's have a counterbalance to Black Friday by having Giving Tuesday as the first Tuesday after Thanksgiving. And it's spread from the US, and it's now spreading globally, and it's now spreading here. So I'm telling you, happy Giving Tuesday, a day in the year to think about how we can support and contribute to things beyond consumerism. And I mention this not just because I think Giving Tuesday is a great thing, but I think it's also about, there's so many ways now people in the world are thinking about how can we rethink our world. We know that our world is in crisis, not environmentally, but also socially. We need to think about our priorities and what we make as priorities for our society differently. And the Social Progress Index is part of that effort. The origin of it is about 5 or 6 years ago when a group of social innovators came together, people from the social enterprise, philanthropic and responsible business sector came together and said, we've had a paradigm of the last 50 years focused on getting more economic growth. We know that's not enough. How do we reshape the conversation about the progress of our societies? And the starting point for our effort was that measurement matters. We manage what we measure. And if we measure the success of our societies entirely in terms of economic growth, we'll focus on that alone. So the Social Progress Index has been created as a counterbalance, not as a replacement for GDP or an opposition to GDP, but as a counterweight, a complement to GDP. So I ask you, please, if you take away one thing today, it's the Social Progress Index is a complementary measure to sit alongside GDP to help us devise more inclusive strategies for development of our societies. So unlike the UN Human Development Index or the OECD Better Life Index or a whole range of well-being indices out there, the Social Progress Index is based entirely on social and environmental indicators. That's the one thing you have to remember. It's not because we're anti-economy or anti-business, but because we believe that creating a complementary measure can help us understand when and how economic growth leads to improvements in people's lives and when it doesn't. And also in creating this measure, we can actually help governments, businesses, civil society make better decisions, better choices about how we allocate capital. So my organisation, the Social Progress Imperative, has been leading the work to develop this index and spread it around the world. We've worked extensively in Latin America, we're now in Europe, we're working in North America, we've just announced that we're going to be creating a state index for India soon, we're moving into Malaysia. This is a global movement and very much working in partnership with others. So let me say a few words about the Social Progress Index itself. The first thing that we begin with is a definition of social progress. And this is our definition. It says, a good society is one that provides for the basic needs of survival for every citizen. Food, water, shelter, safety, basically. Secondly, a good society is one that provides every individual with the building blocks of a better life. Education, information, health, and a good quality environment. And finally, a good society is one that provides every individual with the opportunity to pursue their hopes and dreams, with rights, freedom of choice, freedom from discrimination, and access to the world's most advanced knowledge. This is a definition founded on an extensive literature, especially the works of people like Amartya Sen, Joe Stiglitz and others. Many of you will know the Stiglitz-Sen Fitoussi report of 2009, Mismeasuring Our Lives. It's also based on UN declarations, UN Declaration on Human Rights, the Millennium Development Goals, and now the Sustainable Development Goals. We're never all going to agree on what makes a good society. And we understand that there are values and judgments behind this definition. But what we can say is this is a definition that is founded in the literature, founded in global agreements, and one that we've tested extensively with scholars in economics, political science, philosophers, people in pubs, a whole range of different people. This has come through as a pretty robust definition of what makes social progress. So that's how we've defined social progress, and then what we've done over the last few years is created a global index, and in this year we've been able to measure 133 countries, and we can create an aggregate score for how a country is performing on social progress. And here are the results here. I'm pleased to say that an EU country is the top ranked in the world, Finland. What we'll also see is how the EU in general is doing pretty well. The EU is dominating the upper ranks of global social progress, and the EU on average, I'm afraid, is just below the United States as a whole, but as you see, a lot of the EU countries are in the very high social progress category, and we would hope, and we believe, the objective of cohesion policy is to raise up those that are more lower ranked and bring people together. So that's the Global Social Progress Index. What we've been developing in the last few years is a number of initiatives to develop regional social progress indices. So we were delighted a few years ago when a new partnership was formed that brought together the Social Progress Imperative, my organisation, Orchestra, the Basque Institute of Competitiveness, and DG Regio. And this was a partnership to develop a social progress index for the regions of the EU. The objective of that partnership, and Maury will say more about this later, was really to help regions to identify peers, see where they were stronger and weaker, to inform investment decisions for each of those regions, but also to help the Commission, DG Regio in particular, about contribute to the beyond GDP debate and think about new forms of measurement. But I'll leave Maury to say more about that later. So this is a collaborative initiative between Social Progress Imperative, DG Regio, and Orchestra, the Basque Institute of Competitiveness. We were honoured that we had an eminent scientific committee to support our work, chaired by Enrico Giovannini, who many will know has been one of the great pioneers in the beyond GDP space, and I can't honour his contribution highly enough. But also honoured to have Martine Durand from the OECD, Walter Rademacher, and others joining a very eminent scientific committee that helped shape this project. The EU Regional Social Progress Index is based on the same framework as the Global Index, those same 12 components. But what we've done is we've gone out and we've found European relevant data to measure each of those 12 components. So it's the same structure as the Global Index by which we measure countries, but with a new data set. And so for each of these 12 components of the Social Progress Index, we've got a number of different indicators. There's a huge amount to digest here. Let me just say what we've done is we've tested literally hundreds of different potential indicators to find the indicators that are relevant and credible and fit together well to measure each of these 12 components. And we can talk in detail more, if you like, later about the measurement process. The data itself primarily comes from Eurostat and a range of other European sources. The one real exception is we use some data from Gallup. The Gallup World Values Survey, which is available at NUTS 2 level, does provide a valuable comparative data source on a number of critical issues. So we do have some Gallup data in the model. And what we find when we add up the social progress for each of the 272 NUTS 2 regions of the EU is this picture. So green, dark green is the highest performing, dark red the worst performing. And we see a pattern, and we'll talk in a bit more detail through this as we go through the presentation. We see the general pattern of, yes, Scandinavia is the best performing, and we do find the newest member states in Southeastern Europe, Romania and Bulgaria, are the ones that are showing the lowest scores at the moment. But I actually think as we drill in, there's some interesting nuance here, and the story is more complex than simply the north at the front, then the south, and then the east. There's actually some very interesting nuance in this pattern. As well as providing a score for the total aggregate social progress index, we can also look at performance across those three dimensions of the model. And the first one here is the performance on this area of basic human needs, the food, water, shelter, safety stuff. Now, I think we'd expect European countries to do pretty well here. And that's actually the story if we look at kind of dark greens across most of the EU 15 countries. And then we do see that there's some quite lagging scores, particularly for Romania and Bulgaria. And I'll explain why later, I'm actually quite optimistic that what we can see here is that these scores are going to improve for the regions that are lagging, and that we're going to see quite a strong coming together of a coherence of scores for the EU on basic human needs in quite short time. If we look then at foundations of well-being, we see a different pattern. On the whole, scores are lower. We also see a less clear north-south-east divide. And then if we look at opportunity, we see maybe the north doing well again, but a much more mixed pattern here. And also we see that it's the area in which the EU is doing worst. These areas of rights, freedom of choice, tolerance and access to advanced education are the area where we're struggling most. And again, I'll drill a little further into that in a moment. Let me just quickly take you through now the region's performance, and congratulations to Upper Norrland in Sweden, the highest performing country on the Social Progress Index. Let me say very clearly though, look at the score, 82.33. We're not saying that Upper Norrland is perfect. Every region has room for improvement. I also must always apologise that we end up with Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, Denmark, the usual suspects at the top. If we didn't have the usual suspects at the top, you would think I was mad. So this is what I think is the kind of results we might expect, but I think that's actually a very reassuring result in terms of who we see as the best performing regions. Now, I can't walk you through all 272 regions, but let me just take you through slowly. The slides will be available so you can look at them in more detail, and obviously all the data is online for detailed inspection. But just taking the lowest performing regions, yes, we do find Bulgaria and Romania amongst the least well-performing regions, but interesting, 261st position, there's Campania in Italy, an original founding member of the European Union, there amongst one of the lowest performing groups. Not a great result for Campania. Now, I want to show you what, for me, is the most exciting slide in the world. It's this. So all we've done here is we've added up the regional results to produce country results. So now this is country results based on the EU regional data. So using a different data set, we've calculated the social progress for the countries of the EU. And it's pretty much the same as we find for the global index. This is methodological gold. Yeah. This is if we found different results for the EU regional index as we did for the global index, we would have had a huge problem. But the fact that the results are so consistent and so similar is a great testament to the robustness of the index. So this is fantastic news. Sorry, that may only be of interest to me and about 2 other people, but I'm really excited about this. This is great news. What we've just done here, just popping it in here, is just showing where the capital cities perform. And it's interesting, in some countries, we see the capital city is performing about the same as the country. But others, you see the capital city leading and the capital city lagging. Some interesting variation there. So I want to go a bit further now into this differentiation across countries. And this is what I will call, and I'll only mention this once, this is my Brexit slide. So if you look here, so what we've done here is we've looked at how wide the variation in scores is across country, which we've normalized for the size of the country. So some countries have got 20, 30 regions, some have only got half a dozen. So we've normalized for the range of regions to look at what's your spread of variation in scores. And what we see amongst the regions that have got countries with quite a lot of regions, so the more than 10 regions countries, that Germany has the most consistent results across the different NUTS2 regions. Then the Netherlands, and then the UK. And this is why it's the Brexit slide, is that there's a narrative has emerged around Brexit that it's something to do with urban elite areas jumping ahead and other areas being left behind. We're not finding that in the UK. We're not finding that in the Social Progress Index data. It's remarkably how consistent social progress goals are across the United Kingdom. So if we're looking for the cause of Brexit being inequality in development across the regions, certainly in terms of social progress, we're not finding it. I will not mention Brexit again. Then we see across these other countries the widening gaps of differentiation. In Italy, the biggest variation amongst the big countries. But also strikingly Belgium. Belgium, huge variation in social progress across the regions. And then amongst those with fewer than 10 regions, the biggest variation is Romania, Bulgaria. Is there something about the regions and the countries that are lagging on social progress seem to be those that have the biggest differentiation? Development perhaps has been too focused on the capital regions, hasn't yet spread to the other regions. That's just a hypothesis, just something I've thought of now. So that's kind of the intra-regional variation. Let me talk a bit now about the relationship with GDP per capita. Because one of the big things Social Progress Index can do is, because we have no GDP per capita in the model, we can look at the relationship between the two. We can look at this question of inclusive growth. And what we find is, first of all, the good news. Economic growth is overall good for social progress. That is the first thing that this slide is showing. That as regions get higher GDP per capita, in general, social progress goes up, and there's a significant relationship. The idea of pursuing economic growth is not a stupid one, but nor is it the whole story. There's plenty of noise around this trend line. Here's Upper Norland, the best performing region in the EU on social progress. It's got the same GDP per capita as Bucharest. And here's the worst performing region in the EU, southern Bulgaria. It's got the same GDP as the Podlaskie region in Poland. So yes, better off regions tend to be richer, lower social progress regions tend to be poorer, but it's not the whole story. GDP is not destiny. And we can also see that here for the UK, that we see variation, that you've got Cornwall much, much poorer than London, but with a very similar level of social progress. So if you are developing a development plan for your region that's based entirely on economic development, you have an incomplete development plan. You've got to be having a strategy for social progress as part of your development strategy. So that's the kind of aggregate relationship. What I want to do is just drill a little now into some of the different relationships, the different components of the model. And on this slide, what I've done is just put up the 3 dimensions in the relationship with social progress. And on the left-hand side, you'll see this basic human needs relationship. So there we see a strongly positive, tightly correlated relationship between GDP per capita and social progress. And what that tells me, this is what's telling me that we can probably expect strong convergence on scores on basic human needs across the EU, especially for those countries that are currently lagging behind. We basically know how to solve the problem of basic human needs, and if we get some more economic growth, then we can actually, scores I think will converge on basic human needs. The same is not true of foundations of well-being and opportunity. There's a more complex story going on under those two dimensions. What we find if we're looking at the foundations of well-being dimension, is these two components: access to basic knowledge and environmental quality. There's no relationship between GDP per capita and these scores on these components. Now, for the environment, that's perhaps understandable, that in sense, as you get richer, perhaps your environment deteriorates. As you get richer, perhaps you can invest more in the environment. So you could see why there's an unclear relationship between GDP per capita and the environment. It's interesting, I think, here there's no clear relationship between GDP per capita and access to basic knowledge. That's kind of an interesting one. Love to get people's thoughts on that as an issue. What we can also do is look at different groups of countries. So what I've done here is just repeated the dimension analysis, but split out the EU 15 and the EU 13. Again, here we see an interesting divergence in the patterns. On basic human needs, it's a very similar pattern. Foundations of well-being, quite similar. But on opportunity, a very, very different relationship. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, let me tell you a good news story. One of the reasons I think we don't see a strong GDP per capita relationship with basic education is because actually the EU 13 seems to be doing better at this than the EU 15. Yeah? So at any level of GDP, the EU 13 score seems to be better than the EU 15, which is kind of interesting. So it's not just a story of the EU 15 doing better than the EU 13. On some components, the EU 13 does better. But then if we go into the opportunity dimension, we find a more worrying story, which is here that there seems to be a very different relationship between GDP and tolerance and inclusion in the EU 13 compared to the EU 15. And this is suggesting me that actually in the EU 13 we've got a real challenge here around tolerance and inclusion that is not going to be fixed just by economic development alone. And there's some real issues here in those regions. Let me take you now on to how this can be applied to regions. So again, one of the things the big thing with the Social Progress Index, no GDP per capita in the model. What that allows us to do is not just look at those scores in terms of who's the best and who's the worst, but we can also say, how are you performing relative to your GDP per capita? So we're not saying Upper Norland is best, Southern Bulgaria is worst. We can say, well, compared to regions of similar GDP per capita, how are you doing? And to do that, we use these scorecards. And I've got one example I'll show you, which, just to be neutral, is Brussels. So it's a bit complicated, so let me talk you through this. So what we've done is we've taken Brussels capital region and we've compared it to the 15 regions of the EU closest in terms of GDP per capita. It's very small, but you'll see at the bottom the comparator regions are listed. So we've got Hamburg, Luxembourg, Bratislava, Ile-de-France, etc. So these are the comparator regions, the ones closest to GDP. If we look at the top of the slide, we see the two basic facts. Brussels is the third richest region of the EU in terms of GDP per capita, but it's only 153rd in terms of social progress. There's a very big gap between Brussels' economic performance and its social progress performance. And in aggregate, we find that to be a statistically significant difference, which is why top left you see a red dot. So Brussels is an underperformer on social progress relative to its GDP. And we can then break that down and say, well, what's going on here? What's driving this? And what we see is that on basic human needs across each of the four dimensions, Brussels is doing significantly worse than its peers. On foundations of well-being, on almost all of them, it's significant. And then on opportunity, there's a little bit of good news. Brussels is scoring as you'd expect, within the expected range. That's why you see a yellow dot for opportunity, but is also showing weaknesses on personal freedom and choice and tolerance and inclusion. Why is Brussels doing so badly? Well, obviously it's because a lot of the wealth that's generated within the Brussels capital region is then transferred out, both through people moving and consumption and through fiscal transfers. But I think it also is telling us something, and you will know this better than I, about some of the issues and failings in the governance of the Brussels capital region. And happily talk more about that if you'd like to. But this is therefore providing a really detailed picture of how a region like this is performing on the different aspects. And I know for myself, having worked in the social sector for many years, is one of the challenges is that you've got different sectoral lobbies and sectoral interest groups for health or education or human rights or the environment. What the scorecard can do is put these different aspects of social progress in a common framework to allow us to compare and understand where perhaps the biggest challenges lie and the biggest priorities for improvement. Also, and you won't see this on the Brussels scorecard, is you can see where there are some areas of strength, where there are green markers. And that's just as important, because if we've got regions that are doing really well on some aspect of social progress, well, actually that could mean that there's an innovation, an idea, a policy, a practice, a culture that could be learned from for other regions. So I think I'd always want to emphasise the scorecards can help to identify weakness and priorities for improvement, but critically can identify peers that can be learnt from, ideas that can be spread and shared, just as much as identifying weaknesses. So that's just one scorecard. I can't talk you through the other 271. They're all online, available for all of the regions. Do you want me to... just finish off. Let me just quickly off with a couple of things on thematic findings. So we're just starting to analyse this data and see what it's telling us about some policy issues. So one thing here is just looking at household income against social progress. We see a closer relationship between household income and social progress than GDP per capita and social progress. And again, that probably makes sense intuitively because household income is measuring the household income of the people in the region, whereas GDP can be transferred out. Then there's another sort of tantalising result here, which is that we see no relationship between the unemployment rate and social progress. Now this seems really odd, yeah? Unemployment not related to social progress? I don't think that's what this is telling us, because let me show you the next slide. What we do find is a significant relationship between long-term unemployment and social progress. And I think this is an emerging issue in labour markets, is that the headline figure of unemployment rate, I think, is not necessarily a good indicator or predictor of the level of social progress of a society. If I just maybe parochial for a moment, you know, in the UK, we're seeing some of the lowest historical levels of unemployment, but that's not really feeding into wider well-being. It's actually not just about whether you're not unemployed, it's about the quality of work that you have. Are you working in a 0 hours contract? Are you being paid very low wages? Are you having to work part-time because there's no other choice? So I think actually what this is telling us is the quality of work is the really critical issue, not just the raw unemployment rate. And I think there are other ways we can start exploring this data to try and provide that kind of insight. Finally, just wanted to just pop this one in. There's some overlap in the indicators, but there's a very strong relationship between competitiveness and social progress. And this is one of the really sort of foundational ideas behind our effort, is that it's not a conflict between economic development and social progress. It's actually a win-win here. That societies that build strong social foundations will be those that are the most competitive in the long term. So that's just a few ideas. Let me just finish off by telling you a bit about what we've been doing in the last couple of months since we launched this data. So what we've been doing is talking to regions. So we've already been to Lower Silesia and Helsinki, just working with the local government there, saying how can this data be useful for you? What does this data mean? How can it be applied? We've then got a range of other regions that we're going to be working with through 2017, and we are looking very much for new partners to work with. For us, the Social Progress Index is not an academic exercise. It was an initiative created by change makers in the social sector who wanted to create a practical, useful tool for government, business and civil society. That's why we really want to take this tool and start working with regions to find out how best to make this useful and practical for you and your communities. And that's as well as wider outreach to parliamentarians and other parts of the Commission. Actual real practical work on the ground is a top priority for us going forward, and I can happily talk more about that later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. You got through a fair bit of detail in those 20 minutes, so I'm sure we will have plenty to discuss. I'm just going to check now if there are any immediate questions or reactions before I pass the floor to Moray. I think, did we have a question in the front row?
Thank you. My name is Michael Koch. I'm from the Danish regions. I just noticed, and there was a question for some of your slides, and that's regarding the scorecards for each regions. So the colors that appears in each indicator is only a color you can use for your own region's purpose, because it's not comparable to others, isn't it? So that you're only comparing to comparable regions. So the color depends upon your performance relatively to comparable regions, isn't it so?
Yeah. So the scorecard is there to describe relative performance. So we've got the absolute data performance presented as well, but the scorecard is there to provide the relative performance lens. So the colouring reflects the performance relative to that peer group of countries, of regions of similar GDP per capita. It's not the only lens on the data, but it's one that people find useful.
Okay, if no other questions immediately, I will pass the floor to Maureen.
Thank you very much. I shall be quite brief, and hopefully leave ourselves some discussion and question and answer time afterwards. As Sarah said when she introduced me, I'm head of the Economic Analysis Unit in DG Regional and Urban Policy, and I have been since last month. So it was extremely nice of Michael to give that very comprehensive presentation of what my unit has been up to before I took over. So I'm now better informed than I was before we started. Just to give you a little bit of background on our side, given the name of the unit, you'll obviously understand that we very much deal with looking at the economic impact of cohesion policy, but we also are responsible for writing the next cohesion report, for organising the next Cohesion Forum. We've just finished, or at least my colleagues have, just finished writing the State of European Cities report. And we also are responsible for coordinating the use or treatment of macroeconomic conditionalities under cohesion policy. So we've been fairly busy, and from the 1st of January the unit is being expanded to also have responsibility for the post-2020 preparations for the next programming period, because they obviously felt that first list wasn't long enough. So that's just to give you a little bit of the background. And what I wanted to do was touch on two main issues in relation to the Regional Social Progress Index. And actually, slightly perversely, I wanted to start by saying what it is not, before going on to say a little bit more about what it is and could be. It is not a new allocation system for cohesion policy funding. There's certainly an interest in looking at different allocation systems, particularly for cohesion policy. There's a feeling, I think, among a number of actors that GDP by itself is insufficient as an allocation method, or at least an identification of regions method. But I think we have to be realistic about this, and for a couple of general reasons. Firstly, what we have here is a composite index, consisting of indicators derived from different sources, with different margins of error, with survey data included, and a very impressive, but dare I say it, slightly complex aggregation structure, all of which makes it very difficult to use as an allocation tool or method. The second element is the political reality of allocation discussions at Council and Parliament level. Any radical shift in an allocation system is going to create winners and losers, and that is going to create enormous problems at negotiation level when it comes to examining future regulations. So I think we have to be very careful and realistic about what is done there. There are elements that can be looked at. We already have quite some elements of weighting built into the allocation methods. I would say that so far those have been more traditional weighting methods, levels of unemployment, etc. And there may be possibilities to factor in other elements into that process. But again, having said that, we have to be realistic about how achievable that is from a funding point of view. So that's possibly the bad news for some of you. But what can we do with the Social Progress Index then? And this is, if you'll allow me to focus more on the cohesion policy dimension and what it means here. There are certainly wider potentials out there, and the discussions I imagine you're having with the individual regions can point to that. But I'd like to maybe just target a bit what impact we might see from a cohesion policy perspective. For me, the index needs to be seen above all as a policy tool, providing a range of comparative information at the regional level that has simply not been presented in this way before. It's not been available for regions to be able to look at it in this way. And it provides consistent, comparable, actionable measures of social and environmental issues for the regions in the member states. And for me, most straightforwardly, it offers regions a way of measuring their social progress, both absolutely from their own point of view, but equally, and I think this is extremely important, the point we focused on just there at the end, by comparison with their peers, looking at where they are in relation to regions at the same stage, for example, of GDP per capita. And what I would like to see is regions looking at the results and then feeding them into their policy planning, feeding them into their project development in the context of their cohesion policy programs. This should be part of the overall planning, the overall evaluation of progress in what they're delivering with their cohesion policy programs. A very sensible stage to sit down, look at their overall situation and see where they are on their implementation, on delivery, and evaluate, do they need to factor in this type of new information midway through the programming period to see what they can learn from that, see what they need to change. And that's certainly something I think that we can do at the Commission level as well, to look at the policy mix currently included in programmes to see where adjustments might be needed. And I think it's something that we could look at discussing either in programme monitoring committee meetings, in the annual review meetings that we hold with each member states, to see how much this has been factored in, to see whether member states or regions have thought about this kind of area of work. Equally, the idea of identifying lessons that can be learned from other regions, possibly at the same stage of GDP per capita, but with significantly advanced social progress, for example, and why and how they've achieved that, and trying to make use particularly of the cooperation possibilities that exist across cohesion policy programs, which are there. They're still relatively underused, but linking across programs between two or more regions and having cooperation actions to learn from each other seems a very sensible approach. A push, if you like, overall to encourage regions to maybe look beyond their comfort zones, look beyond their traditional approach to the use of cohesion policy, and to try and factor in new ideas and new concepts and dare I say, even experiment a little bit in this area. More broadly, from, if you like, the Commission side, from my Directorate General's side, what the Social Progress Index offers us is, well, first and foremost, I think Michael mentioned that in one of the slides, it allows us to make a further contribution to the GDP and beyond debate, very much so. We've been very active in this area over recent years, and the next step in the path will be the new Regional Competitiveness Index, which is due out at the beginning of next year, which will enable you to update your slide at the end there. Hopefully it shows the same pattern. And I can already say that one of the things that we want to do is learn already from what the Social Progress Index has done, and we're very much looking at trying to use the same kind of scorecard approach, allowing regions to compare where they are on a regional competitiveness basis, using the same kind of formatting. And what we do then with these initiatives is we also, I think, more broadly underline the need for more harmonised data on social progress at a regional level, but also more data at a regional level more generally. And I think this is, if you like, my final point from an internal selfish perspective, if you like, is that the more regional data we have available, the more strength we have on our arguments in relation to regional and cohesion policy, particularly coming back to where I started, looking forward to the post-2020 period. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Maury. That was also very fascinating and very concise, so congratulations to the two speakers. I will firstly check in with you, Wolfgang, to see if there are any questions coming in from the online community.
No, there are none. The community is indeed quite silent and small. We have 10 people following, but now that I have the microphone, maybe I could ask a question to Maury. You were rightly saying that this is not an allocation tool, and I think it was never meant to be one, but my question goes into the direction of the 2020 indicators, more for programming purposes. I mean, we know that they have been used, like educational attainment or unemployment, you name it, poverty, have been used to do some of the programming. And now that this recent commission has not, let's say, shown the same enthusiasm with Europe 2020 and the indicators as the previous one, my question would be, what happens after 2020 to these kind of indicators that have served to program and to picture indeed some of the objectives in the programs? Will you continue with the old ones? Will there be new ones? Is there any thinking in DG Regio or the other DGs concerned about which kind of programming indicators or objectives to be attained will there be in the next period?
I think my very easy answer to that is it's far too early to say anything concrete. But it's a very good question for the longer term. I think that one of the things that we need to see is what on our side we come up with from a longer term development perspective. So, you know, beyond cohesion policy, beyond even necessarily the next financial framework, but where does the Commission go after Europe 2020? And there were one or two, I would say, hints, if you saw it, in the communication on the Sustainable Development Goals that came out last week, I think. And there's a couple of hints there about using the Sustainable Development Goals as a basis for moving forward, but it's very early days. I think it's, you know, my colleagues in the Secretariat General are still thinking about how that goes forward. So there's, as I say, one or two hints there, but beyond that it's a little too early to say.
So the opportunity to jump in there on the point about Sustainable Development Goals. As very much we started developing the Social Progress Index before the goals were agreed, but we were very much keeping an eye on the process. And what we're seeing is that Social Progress Index is being used in different parts of the world as a kind of practical tool to track progress against the SDGs. I mean, I think the SDGs, one, are very complex, the 17 goals. Secondly, there are lots of gaps in how they're going to be measured and tracked. And thirdly, they don't really have a way of aggregating total performance against the SDGs. You can't just add up the 17 goals and get an aggregate performance measure. So an actual demand we've been getting from some partners around the world has been, can we use SPI as a way of not tracking the detail of the Sustainable Development Goals, but as a way of tracking the spirit of them, especially if tracking them in detail is currently impossible or very, very difficult. And so that's a sort of another application of the Social Progress Index, is it is strongly aligned with the SDGs and can work as a kind of spirit of the SDGs tracker at least. And that's a very important part of the process for us. And I think, as you say, Maury, that's going to be SDGs are going to frame every conversation, I think, going forward and are going to be critical. So for us, that alignment with the SDGs was a crucial part of it.
Any further questions? Well, maybe I'll put one to you, Michael, then. You mentioned that you've been working with a few regions in 2016. You have a few more on your list for 2017. Can you already point or tell us, have there been policy shifts? Have the regions sat down and designed things differently? Have they spent money differently? Have you any concrete examples that you can give us?
Give me a chance. I've only been out for 2 months. So we've had some initial discussions, but what perhaps I can do is talk about how it's been used elsewhere. So actually the first country in the world that has a national development plan that has a social progress target that sits alongside a GDP target is Paraguay. Paraguay has a lot of issues around inclusive growth. And that's why they've actually hardwired social progress index into their national development plan to 2030. And that's then resulted in some of the targets that have been set, particularly things like eliminating child malnutrition by 2018. Budgetary allocations have flowed from that, and then programs have flowed on from that. And since that's why we created this. We created this because we want to see fewer children going to bed hungry. And so we're seeing the way that by creating that headline, that target, and hardwire that into government, that can then cascade through the budgetary process. So that's one kind of application. What we've also found is that it can be a very powerful common language for collaboration. We actually work with Coca-Cola in the Amazon region of Brazil, where they were very engaged in certain communities around supply chain issues and where depopulation was actually a commercial risk for Coca-Cola. And what they found was that by applying the Social Progress Index to those communities, it allowed a stronger dialogue between government and business and civil society about the real needs of communities, and has led to sort of new development strategies in terms of where capital is invested. Not new money, not this, as Maurice said, not this about new money being allocated, but the use of existing resources more effectively around the needs of communities. And finally, I think one of the most tantalizing things we're seeing now is the growing interest from private capital markets. Private capital markets who are seeing Social Progress Index as being a measure of the social sustainability of communities that can then actually be affecting the sustainability of sovereign or sub-sovereign debt, which I think is very exciting. So we're seeing a range of different applications. Give me a few more months and I'll come back and tell you what we're doing in Europe.
Yeah, hello. I would like to thank you for your very interesting presentations, and I've got a question for Morey. I would like to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit on the regional competitiveness index you mentioned earlier.
A little bit, yes, because it's still quite new to me as well. This will be, it's the second version of the index. I think the first one came out in 2013, which is actually the one, I guess, Michael, you used on the slide there, the comparison. And it's, so basically this is the update taking account of the latest information over the last 3 years. It is constructed in a very similar way from an index point of view. So there are a number of specific factors identified looking at issues such as education attainment, levels of infrastructure, broadband, amount of connectivity, to name the 4 that I can think of off the top of my head. And there is an overall index calculated at the regional level across the entire EU. The one thing where we've changed the regions slightly is that for some of the capital cities we've created capital cities plus commuting zones, because from a competitiveness point of view it's better to try and look at the whole area around those cities. But essentially it's the same type of issue but focusing very much on competitiveness. My colleagues are working on that at the moment. We're hoping, I think, late January, early February that's going to be available.
Just on the, I showed the slide about the competitive to Social Progress Index relationship a couple of years ago. So one of our, so Social Progress Imperative is supported by a range of philanthropic foundations, Skoll Foundation from California, Rovina Foundation from Latin America, and also Deloitte. And Deloitte did some work for us a couple of years ago, looking at the relationship on the global index between social progress and foreign direct investment flows. And that had a very sort of interesting result that especially for highly developed societies, there was a very significant relationship with tolerance and inclusion and foreign direct investment. So I think what some of the social progress index data can complement competitiveness data, looking at beyond some of those traditional competitiveness factors to see how that might be linked to certainly attracting FDI, and we can certainly share that report that's out there. So I think there's ways that this data can generate insight into some of those wider competitiveness issues as well. And perhaps surprising factors can be important to competitiveness, not just the usual things.
Good morning. Without having wanting to criticize the index, because we do think it's a fairly useful instrument, but I wonder if you could say a few words on the left out indicators, and in particular, for example, there's an indicator that was left out, which was the pre-primary enrollment, which is a very hot topic at the moment here. For example, the DG on education is looking at it at the moment. On employment as well, there's already extensive literature on the impact that pre-enrollment has in a lot of other indicators that actually then show up in the index. So if you could say a few words about the ones that were left out, and if there's any future plans of updating or revising it in the future. Thank you.
It's a great question, and if we're happy to stay all day, I can talk you through all the issues. We do not pretend this is perfect. And there are so many different things that we'd love to improve. All we would claim is that it's generating some robust results. It's not perfect. I'd actually go to the other end of the scale. For the one that really bothers me is the fact that we've got no meaningful, relevant data around aging. I think the speed with which the demographic crisis is coming upon us, the ability of our societies to cope with managing an aging population and create good aging is a huge social policy issue that we haven't got to measuring. So there are some issues that no one's grasped with measuring yet, and then there are probably issues whereby we haven't got the right data that we could use. So I can't answer specifically on the pre-primary why that indicator was left out. It may be the data wasn't available. Also, there can be an occasion where, for slightly techie reasons, you've got different indicators, and they actually are collinear. So actually the two indicators are telling you the same thing, so you don't need to include both indicators in the model. So sometimes you'll drop an indicator. On the unemployment issue, it's one we've debated quite heavily. Are measures of employment an economic issue or not? And what we've decided ultimately was to take a strong line, and anything that could be an economic indicator, leave it out of the model. But actually the opportunity then is that we can then take some of those indicators and look at their relationship with social progress. And I do think these findings around employment, unemployment are actually quite tantalizing about helping us think through employment policy. So almost by not putting into the model the thing that we associate with social policy, unemployment or employment, allows us to drill in and investigate those further. Just another thing we've been looking at recently is how if you look at youth unemployment, we don't find any relationship particularly strongly with access to advanced education. We find a much stronger relationship with access to information and communications. So it can be the way that you can decompose the model, look at some of those relationships to start generating some policy insights. So just because it's not in the model doesn't mean we can't integrate that into the data and into the analysis. But and finally, let me say, we've been doing this for 4 years now. The global index has improved massively due to feedback. So we really, really appreciate and want your feedback. We do not pretend it's perfect. Feedback makes it better. So please, please, please let us know what you think.
I was very interested in the slide you showed on the capital cities. And one theme of regional and cohesion policy over the last few years has been the shift to the urban agenda, which is gradually has taken off. Now, obviously, if you want to look at cities and data, perhaps not everything that you have is breakable down to NUTS 3 level. But I'm wondering, do you see some way where the SPI can interface a little bit with the EU's urban agenda?
Yeah, I think there are some fascinating results for urban areas. I showed you the Brussels scorecard. I could have showed you the inner London scorecard where I live, and it's pretty much as bad. And I'm actually, I'm ashamed that I'm living in the richest region of the EU, and our social indicators are still not that great, not that spectacular. And that's a conversation we're actually, taking to policymakers in London. Sarah, as you say, sadly, we can't take all this data below the NUTS 2 level. A lot of it's only available at NUTS 2. But what we are now talking to some of the partners with is, can we create a more granular measure? So again, we'd have to find a new data set for whether it would be London or for regions of Ireland or for Lower Silesia. There would, in conversation with various partners, but could we create an even more granular social progress index? And I think certainly our lesson, our experience elsewhere in the world is the more granular you get, the more power you get, because there are so many of these interesting relationships. And one of the really exciting indices we did elsewhere was actually for the city of Bogota, looking at the districts of Bogota city. And for that index, we actually had time series data. And what we found was actually over the last 10 years, inequality has narrowed in Bogota, which is interesting. But also, this was linked to a very sort of radical and controversial set of policies within the city that's actually led to some re-evaluation about the success of those policies. So I think we really would love to be contributing more to that urban agenda. I think we may have to try and break the data down a bit further, but I think there's a real interest and appetite in doing that. So always happy to talk to people about how we can do that further.
Thanks, Michael. Any last questions? If not, we will draw to a close. Maureen, I don't know if you want to have a last couple of minutes. We have one in the front row.
Hello, my name is Juliana Panzer. I'm coming from the local authorities of Saxony in Germany. And I just wondered about the household income. For me, it seemed that the SPI and the household income has a closer relationship than to the GDP. And so I understand that taking such a complex index like the SPI for an allocation method is not it's not workable, or it's not it's an easy bet to take a simple index like a household income. Is this a possibility to convince someone to shift just from a single index like the GDP to a household income? Is this something we could dream of?
It's always possible to dream. My own personal view is that from identification of eligible regions point of view, you're going to remain with the GDP per capita. I don't see how you will be able to convince some people about the benefits of moving, but they're going to be the people that are going to benefit from that change. And it's the people in the other direction, because it's essentially at that stage you're looking at a zero-sum game, that you're always going to face challenges. I was quickly looking online, because the one example that's worth mentioning in this context is Bratislava, because they rank 5th in Europe on GDP per capita, and they rank 181st on the Regional Social Progress Index. And they've already, been quite vocal on the difficulties facing their city, with so much of the wealth base of the city is from people coming into the city and leaving every single day, and not helping them address the education system, not helping them address the health system, etc. But that, I think, is a slightly different issue from the identification of eligibility or not. It's what you do once you're eligible with the money that's allocated. And therefore it's about maybe a different targeting of the expenditure once it's there. Now, there may be some elements that, as I said, you can factor in as some of the weighting aspects. Particularly, I think, for the more developed regions, there are quite a number of variables that are added to the process in order to weight the final allocations at the moment. So it's possible. How much you would get away with adding an additional income factor, GDP plus household, or GNI, I think is going to be a challenge as well. There's to some extent an inbuilt favoritism towards the status quo and those kind of things in that process.
Yeah, I use the opportunity, Maury, to ask you another question, which you may not like to answer. As we are all writing our work plans for next year, my question would be: we know about the Cohesion Forum and its date. It will be end June, I think. What I haven't heard about is when the Cohesion report is going to be published, and maybe in addition, whether or not this will have special features like in the past, for example, 10 ideas about the future of cohesion policy post 2020, or even launching a public consultation as it was the case earlier.
Timing wise, September, October is the plan, which is possibly may change, but that's what we're working towards at the moment. Content wise, I really can't answer because I don't know. It's dependent on what the Commission as a whole wishes to say before publication of the MFF, and that's a little bit the repeated debate that we have at this stage in the process every 6-7 years. This time round we have a fixed date for the MFF in the regulations. It has to be produced by the end of the year, and the question there a little bit is how much are we allowed to say prior to that, and how much needs to follow on from the MFF. My own feeling is that we may be limited in what we can say even by the autumn. But there are variables in there. The Cohesion Forum, for example, is one of those variables because you can't stop people standing up and saying what they want. It's a little bit different putting it down in black and white. So that's the broad time. It's also slightly unusual because normally you would have the cohesion report before the forum. But our initial thinking, if you go back a few months, had been that even the report itself might need to follow the MFF. And so that's one of the elements that we've kind of looked at a little bit more flexibly. Maybe it's linking it slightly closer to the forum so you can perhaps pick up some of the ideas coming out of the forum, for example. But that's where we are on the thinking at the moment.
Okay, I don't see any further questions, so maybe I'll bring this to a close. I want to thank our host, Wolfgang, and the Committee of the Regions. I want to thank Michael and Maury for both making extremely interesting presentations. I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to go and look at the website of the SPI. That you will find plenty to keep you occupied and to keep you thinking, to stimulate some thoughts. I think you've now got we have a last question.
I'm sorry. I just noticed there was one question that was not really answered, and that is, can we expect an update?
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is we're measuring outcomes, so the data will not move that quickly. So I don't think there's an urgency about doing one next year or whatever. But in a sense, I think part of it is, I think we're hearing regions want us to be able to see this. Certainly the data is trackable, is much more powerful when it's trackable over time. But if you want it, tell us.
I assume that at least at the open days next year you'll resurface perhaps with some update, but perhaps on other occasions as well. So thank you to our speakers. I think you've got a good idea now of what this SPI entails and potentially how it might feed into your deliberations in terms of preparing your regions for lobbying the Commission and DG Regio for the next round of cohesion policy. And I'm sure that the presentation can be made available, probably via you, Wolfgang, if anyone would like to. It's already been circulated. Okay, thank you very much.